Good day, folks. Let's get this show on the road. This is Geopolitics, politics after a long time of domestic politics. And look what we have here is absolute chaos in this region. Adal Badal, all this area is going to get impacted, and all because of what's happening here, whether it is in Israel, what's happening in Iran with Iran, what's happening in Afghanistan and Syria, all had to do with the whoosh, that's the moving out of the United States from that region. And there is, and it is definitely, this region, as I'll come up to it, will impact India in a big way, and we really have to take cognizance of that and play our cards absolutely with care. And here I must point out to you that there are a couple of domestic incidents that have currently happened that I feel will have a huge impact on our foreign policy as we go forward. Welcome, folks. Lots being said about what's the implications of what's happening in the Middle East, but the best analysis I think that's been done is by C. Raja Mohan, and I will read parts of it out to you, and I think it will be an interesting listen. Right? He says the Middle East reset. India, Pakistan long assumed that American role in Middle East was unchanging, but must now imagine a region that is not micromanaged by the US. He says, India and Pakistan, like most other regional actors and powers, long assumed that the American role in the greater Middle East was unchanging. Both Delhi and Rawalpindi must now imagine a Middle East that is not micromanaged by the US. Okay? Goes on to say, after the costly and prolonged military interventions in the Middle East, Washington has begun to see it can't fix centuries-old conflicts in the region. Even more important, the US now has other urgent priorities such as challenges from an assertive China. As America steps back from the Middle East, most regional actors either need alternate patrons to reduce tensions with their neighbors. Although China, this is what you've got to remember, although China and Russia have regional ambitions, neither of them bring the kind of strategic heft America brought to bear on the Middle East all these decades. And that is something you must remember, folks, before we jump in and say China is doing everything. Learning to live with neighbors has then become an urgent priority. Turkey has figured that its troubled economy can't sustain the ambitious regional policies of President Tayyip Erdogan. After years of challenging Saudi leadership of the Islamic world, Erdogan is offering an olive branch to Riyadh. He is also trying to make nice with Egypt. Okay. After years of intense mutual hostility, Saudi Arabia and Iran are now exploring means to reduce bilateral tensions and moderate their proxy wars in the region. Saudi Arabia is also trying to heal the rift with the Gulf by ending the earlier effort to isolate Qatar. These changes come in the wake of the big moves last year by some Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco and Sudan, to normalize ties with Israel. Barring Turkey, which turned hostile to India under Erdogan, Delhi has managed to expand its ties with most regional actors. And that's what you got to remember, folks. If Delhi has been pragmatic, Pakistan has struggled to recalibrate its policies towards the Middle East. It's unable to overcome the domestic ideological issues. Bajwa's efforts culminated in Imran Khan's visit to Saudi Arabia last week. If religious ideologues in Pakistan had expected a thundering Saudi condemnation of India's Kashmir policy, they would have been deeply disappointed. The Saudi-Pak joint statement simply supported a dialogue between India and Pakistan on all issues, including Kashmir. Pakistan's about turn on Saudi Arabia underlines that the subcontinent does not have the luxury of relying on old ideological tropes like pan-Islamism, pan-Arabism, or anti-Americanism in a region that is undergoing major transformation. Right? Meanwhile, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan poses major challenges to the subcontinent. Delhi and Rawalpindi, for very different reasons, would have liked to see the US forces stay forever in Afghanistan. For Delhi, American military presence would have kept a check on extremist forces and created conducive conditions for an Indian role in Afghanistan. For Rawalpindi, American military presence in Afghanistan keeps the US utterly dependent on Pakistan for geographic access and operational support, and that dependence in turn could be mobilized against India. And this is when I come back later, you'll see why China is jumping up and down and saying what it's saying. The prospect of transborder links between the Taliban and other extremist forces in the region is a challenge that South Asian states will have to confront sooner than later. Soaring levels of violence in Afghanistan and last week's attack on Mohammad Nasheed, the former president of Maldives, underlines South Asians' enduring challenges with terrorism. Finally, the current turmoil in the greater Middle East underlines the dangers of the subcontinent forgetting the raison d'etre or nationalist interest of the state must prevail over all other considerations, including religious ones. Now here, like I said, there are a couple of incidents because of the turmoil in the Middle East are going to have a negative impact on foreign policy and what's happening in domestic. I'll tell you what. Firstly, in Jammu and Kashmir, which we kind of put a veil over, where the things are not as good and not as good. Defying threats, Srinagar hosts second fashion show in a fortnight, but then you have teen among 5 terrorists killed in J&K encounters. Then you had something called the state of distrust. The J&K administration order on security threat posed by its employees is arbitrary and draconian, belies claim of normalcy. So Kashmir can have an important role to play, folks, in what happens with the extremists, in what is happening in the extremism in Palestine and what's happening in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. So we've got to close that loop sooner than later. More as I said, let me tell you the other incident is this. Row in UP after government raises mosque Waqf board to move HC. This is something, the 100-year-old mosque has been demolished in the middle of the night. Maybe it has some legal sanctity to it as the government claims. But it had protection from the High Court. What is important is the timing of it. Why is it done now? Right? There's so much happening. Let me just tell you, this is again done by the dubious designs of the Chief Minister and this Hindutva brigade in order to divert attention. There's a lot of information going around town now which says that, the Jat communities of both Hindus and Muslims of Western UP have come together. There's also a lot of news doing the round that communities have come together in Uttar Pradesh to tackle this virus because the government is just nowhere to be seen. Now, how does the government, which is running up into election in 2002, create the divide again? This is it, folks. This is it. Because here's what we've been having. Some earlier, now petition seeks ASI survey of Agra Mathura Mosque. Then you have Mathura plea now seeks ASI survey of Choti Masjid in Agra. And this is what Swaminathan Iyer had to write. Apex Court must stop conversion of places of worship. He says, this threatens endless new communal battles that were supposed to end with Places of Worship Act 1991 that froze the religious status of all shrines as of August 15, 1947, ending pending suits and banned fresh ones. So this is dubious, folks. Important to note of the timing. I don't care about the legal sanctity and maybe they were encroaching, but it's a 100-year-old mosque. The timing, dubious. For domestic politics, is going to have serious repercussions internationally, because this is what the jihadis will globally catch on to now, to create fire create a fire and more trouble. And China will be the first to come and ensure that they put gasoline and petrol on this flame, folks. We are doing ourselves a huge disservice. You had these guys running around in West Bengal creating Ghuspaitiyas and creating problems with Bangladesh. Now you're going to have problems by our Chief Minister in UP, again having huge global consequences at absolutely the wrong time when Israel and Palestine and the Middle East are going up in flames, folks. So what do we have here? After violence at holy site, Jerusalem, rockets fired at Israel, 9 killed in Gaza. Then it was Israel army launches airstrikes on Gaza, and things have really gone bad. As it says, Israel-Palestine violence escalates to major crisis. Gaza toll 53, and I believe it's gone past 200 now. Then you really had, it's really, what you need to understand here is, right, that if some people who don't, right, you have Gaza, that is. So Palestine is in two parts. One is Gaza, which is controlled by the Hamas, which is actually what Israel considered as a terrorist arm funded by Iran. Then you have the West Bank, which is essentially controlled by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and that by and large has not created havoc or crisis for Israel. And if you see Fauda and all that, the security systems work fairly closely to each other to ensure that there are no major terrorist events, and people from the West Bank always cross over into Israel. However, of late, obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu, this war works for him because he's not won the elections, right? A war always seems to work for anybody who's in power. However, he may have not, he may not be fully there, right? So this also could be a war between Hamas and the PLO, as some tapes have suggested, that this is the time for Hamas to show off and put the leadership of the Palestinian Liberation PLO in place, right? So it's kind of worked in a very, very sinister fashion for Netanyahu, for the Hamas, and the collateral damage have ended up to being the innocent Palestinians, right? So what do we have here? It says, finally, because of the kind of violence, now the other thing that's happening is rupturing in West Asia, because you just had, as like I said, a change in perception and written it between some of the Arab nations like the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Sudan, with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now they're in a flux because now Iran's got its way, because Hamas has stepped in, and look at the schism it's caused, right? It's probably, Iranians have probably come out ahead on this game. As I said, Islamic nations slam Israel and each other's ties to the country. So Iran's been able to create massive amount of confusion in that area. Right? Then you have the standoff in West Asia continues. The violence comes at a time when the political situation in Israel and Palestine is unstable. The PM's position is weak, while the Palestinian National Authority has lost ground to a violent Hamas. So this is the issue. While Israel must take the lion's share of the blame for casualties in the round of violence, the Hamas has done Palestinians no favor with its rocket attacks and its inability to provide economic growth or any other benefits to Gaza's beleaguered population. Israel's hopes that it will break the back of Hamas with this round of bombardment are not likely to be realized going by past experience, right? Then you have, obviously, the US is, like India, is having to play both sides. Blinken signals no immediate US press for Middle East truce. But I'm just reading in the foreign policy press that by Thursday there's a possibility of a ceasefire. Then you have India reiterate support to just Palestine cause, not among 25 BB thankful. So anyway, Israel's not going to thank us, right? But this is what you need to know and what you understand. New dimensions of the Israel-Hamas conflict. And this is written by P.R. Kumarasamy. Going by the recent developments, the current round of hostilities will be as severe as the last one. Then he says, the conflict is not confined to the Gaza Strip and has already spread to the West Bank. It's a big difference and change, right? The ongoing violence is different, and there are clashes between Israel and the Palestinians in different parts of West Bank. Then he says, this time around, protests against Israeli operations against Hamas have incensed Israeli Arab, leading to riots in several mixed towns such as Beersheba, Ramleh, Lod, Haifa, Acre, and Sakim. And this is a change, right? Then he says, 3. The Israel-Hamas violence has been used by elements in Lebanon and Syria to launch rocket attacks from the north. He says, now this is the important part, one should expect militant groups in these countries, namely the Hezbollah in Lebanon and and anti-Assad forces in Syria, to join the fight. Thus, Israel is facing multiple challenges, the worst in its history. For the only similarity with the previous violence is the lukewarm administration in Washington. There are acute differences between the two over Iran and Biden's desire to tone down some of Donald Trump's pro-Israeli policies and postures before the current crisis. 5. While the international community wants de-escalation and an early end to the conflict, the chances of successful external mediation are not bright. Iran wields considerable influence on Hamas, but has emerged as a nemesis of Israel, Pakistani peace, and under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey is now also in the enemy camp. Though China and Russia have been engaging with Hamas, their diplomatic capital is not commensurate with the challenge. Absolutely not, and that's what I've been telling you. And what do you have here? While this is happening, we are not thanked. Here what happened. Israel bans travel to COVID-hit India. That's another pin that falls as far as India is concerned, folks. And today we end this with the crisis here, which is, going to have implications for India. and the Middle East, and then India. And tomorrow we will cover the other parts, which are Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan, where all this whole process, the change that is undergoing, is because of the vacuum that is being left by the movement of the United States. Jai Hind.